The veil had belonged to their grandmother, and before her to someone whose name neither sister could recall. It was Honiton lace, fine as old breath, with a border of worked flowers that had gone pale gold at the edges rather than white. Cecily had held it once as a child and been told not to touch it. She was holding it now. Dorothea stood at the window of their shared room, already dressed in traveling clothes, her wedding gown folded neatly across the chair as though it had simply stepped out of itself and decided to rest. The morning was gray and cold, the kind of November morning that arrived without apology and stayed until dark. Somewhere below them, Moorland Hall was filling with noise, with hired footmen and florists and the particular agitated energy of their mother in a state of organized triumph. "You only need to stand where I would stand," Dorothea said. She did not look at the window when she said it. She looked at her own hands, folded in her lap like a woman practicing a kind of prayer. "No one will look at your face. They never do." Cecily did not point out that the ceremony required speech. She did not point out that the Earl of Wyndham would, in fact, look at the face beneath the veil when the vicar gave the instruction to raise it. Dorothea knew all of this, and had decided not to think about it, which was its own kind of courage, or its own kind of cowardice, depending on how generously one was feeling at 7 in the morning. "He will not go through with it," Cecily said instead. Dorothea looked up and something in her expression flickered. "He will be confused," she said. "He will ask questions. And in the confusion, Thomas will have time to reach the post road, and by the time anyone thinks to send after us, we will be beyond Hertfordshire. The license is already arranged." "And what becomes of me?" Cecily said. "In the confusion." It was not quite a question. Dorothea had no answer for it that was not, at its root, the same answer Lady Moorland had always given. Cecily would manage. Cecily always managed. Cecily was the spare, which meant she was the one from whom things could be taken without consequence because there was no consequence attached to her that anyone had thought to name. She set the veil down carefully on the dressing table and looked at her own reflection for a moment. 23 years old, a plain gown, the color of winter sky. Hair pinned back with the kind of competence that no one ever complimented, because it was only competence, not beauty. She had spent her entire life in this house being the version of herself that was not Dorothea. Not the prize, not the investment, not the daughter who mattered to the ledger. She had made a kind of home of that. She had not expected it to be taken from her as well. "I will do it," Cecily said. Dorothea crossed the room and embraced her with the fierce, brief grip of someone catching at something before it falls. Then she was gone. Soft shoes on the back stairs, the servants' door, the lane behind the kitchen garden where Thomas Crane was waiting with a hired carriage, and 3 years of suppressed devotion. Cecily lifted the veil again and looked at the pale gold flowers along its edge. The lace was cold against her fingers. Downstairs, their mother was calling for someone. She did not go down for another quarter of an hour. If you have ever stood in the place where someone else was meant to stand, you know what the air feels like. There is a quality to borrowed spaces that no amount of stillness can dissolve. Stay close to this story, because what follows is not what anyone in that house expected, including Cecily. To understand what happened in the church, one must go back 3 weeks, to the day the Earl of Wyndham first arrived at Moorland Hall for the betrothal visit that their mother had arranged with such exhausting thoroughness that every candlestick in the house had been repolished twice. She had spent those 3 weeks doing what she always did in her mother's house, which was making herself useful in the spaces no one else occupied. She managed the household accounts when Mrs. Fellows was unwell. She read aloud to the 3 youngest Moorland cousins who had been brought in to swell the domestic tableau. She sat in the corner of the drawing room when evening guests came, poured tea when the footman was slow, and retired before anyone thought to notice whether she was there at all. She had not expected to speak more than twice to the Earl of Wyndham. She had not expected to speak to him at all. Julian Ashby, 4th Earl of Wyndham, arrived on a grey Tuesday in October with 2 carriages, 3 horses, and the particular stillness of a man who had learned that stillness is the safest posture for a person of consequence in a room full of people who want things from him. He was 34, dark-haired, broad through the shoulder in a way that his navy tailcoat accommodated, with elegance rather than strain. His face was strong rather than handsome, with a jaw that tended to set hard when he was thinking, and eyes of a gray so pale they registered as cold, before one was close enough to see they were not cold exactly, only watchful. Lady Morland received him with the particular radiance of a woman who had spent 6 months engineering an outcome, and was now watching it materialize in her entrance hall. Dorothea appeared beside her, beautiful and composed, and utterly terrified in a way that only Cecily could read, because Cecily had been reading Dorothea's face for 25 years, and knew the precise way her sister's hands went still when she was afraid. The Earl greeted Dorothea with correct courtesy. He shook hands with the elder Morland cousins. He accepted a glass of wine he did not drink, and then he turned, because Cecily had just entered the room from the direction of the library, with a stack of household accounts under one arm, and had not been expecting anyone to be in the passage. "I beg your pardon," she said, and stepped aside to let him pass. "There is room enough," he said. He did not step aside. He looked at the accounts under her arm, and then at her face, and something in his expression changed in a way that was so small and so controlled that no one else in the hall would have noticed it. Cecily noticed it, because she was the kind of woman who had trained herself to notice things no one else was watching for. He did not speak again. He continued down the passage, and she continued toward the stairs, and that was all. It was nothing. It was 3 seconds in a hallway with a stranger. She thought about it for the rest of the evening, which irritated her very much. The betrothal visit was arranged to last a fortnight. It lasted 3 weeks, because the Earl found reasons to extend it that Cecily could not quite account for, and her mother did not bother to question. Dorothea had, by the second day, retreated to a pattern of brief appearances at meals and long absences afterward, which Lady Morland excused as nerves, and which Cecily knew was Dorothea slipping notes to Thomas Crane through Mrs. Copper-Raff. Fellows who was too kind and too loyal and too old to say no. This left Cecily as the person who was in practice present when the Earl required a conversant member of the household. It happened without design. He would come down to breakfast when Dorothea was still in her rooms. Cecily would be at the sideboard, because she was always the first downstairs, and he would sit at the far end of the table. And eventually the silence between them would require filling. And she was not, whatever her mother believed, incapable of filling it. The first time he asked her a direct question, she answered it directly, and he went. Still, in a way she had not seen him go still before. He had asked whether she thought the Morland entail had been fairly drawn, and she had said that it had not, and that the men who drew it thought fairness was something that accrued to people who already had it. He had looked at her for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he picked up his coffee cup. "That is," he said, "a more precise answer than I expected." "You asked a precise question," Cecily said. The pause was exactly 1 beat too long. She felt it in her chest, that pause, like a gear catching on something before it turned over. The following days, those breakfasts accumulated. He asked about the library, and she told him which volumes were worth reading and which had been purchased for their spines. He asked about the tenants on the Morland estate, and she told him more than her mother would have wished her to tell, because she could not see a reason to mislead him and a number of reasons why accuracy mattered. He asked her once at the edge of the formal garden on a cold afternoon whether she found the country dull, and she said that she found the country honest, which was not the same thing as dull and not the same thing as pleasant. He had stopped walking when she said that. The garden path was gray stone and the elms behind the house had gone bare, and the cold air carried the smell of frost and fallen leaves, and she was standing 3 feet from him in a brown wool pelisse that had been let out at the seams the previous winter and showed it. She was aware of every inch of that distance. She was aware of him the way one is aware of a source of heat when the room is cold, not by looking at it, but by the specific quality of warmth along one side of her body. She was aware of the pulse at her own throat in a way that was inconvenient, and that she chose not to examine. She had turned away before he spoke again, because turning away was what one did. She did not know what he had seen in those breakfasts, those conversations, those quiet afternoons. She knew what she was. She had heard it plainly enough the morning of the second week when Lady Morland had shown the Earl's aunt through the house, and they had passed the library without knowing Cecily was inside at the shelves. "Cecily is our second daughter," her mother had said, and her voice carried the precise inflection of someone categorizing a piece of furniture. "She assists with the household. She is capable enough. You need not concern yourself with her." "Is she likely to be troublesome?" the older woman had asked, and her voice was colder and more direct than her nephew's, the voice of someone who had spent decades clearing complications from the paths of people she considered important. "No," Lady Morland said. "The spare is never troublesome. She has no standing to be." The footsteps receded. Cecily stood at the shelves with a book she had not opened, and the words settled into her the way cold settles into an unheated room, gradually, from the extremities inward. She had heard it before, in a dozen different registers. She had known it for most of her life. She did not cry, because crying required that one expected something different, and she had not expected anything different since the age of 14, when she understood that Dorothea would marry well, and she would manage what remained. What she had not expected was for the Earl to knock on the library door the following morning and ask her to walk with him. The day was cold and bright, the kind of November morning that comes once or twice in the season and makes one briefly believe winter will be merciful. They had gone past the kitchen garden out along the lane that bordered the south fields, and Cecily had been telling him about the drainage problem in the lower field, that her mother had been refusing to address for 3 years, when she stopped because she had heard a child crying. The girl was 12, perhaps a little less. She stood in the lane beside a wheelbarrow that held what appeared to be the contents of a small room, bundled in cloth and roped down badly, so that the corners showed. A woman, presumably her mother, was arguing in a low, fierce voice with one of the Morland footmen who had been sent to enforce Lady Morland's notice of removal for unpaid rent. The girl cried without sound, which was worse than crying with sound, because it was the crying of someone who has learned not to be heard. The Earl stopped walking. He said nothing, he watched. Cecily calculated quickly, because she had always been good at numbers even when the numbers were inconvenient. She had £2 and 7 shillings in the inside pocket of her pelisse, which was the sum total of her available money until the new year when her small annuity arrived. The rent arrears would be more than that. She asked the footman, and the footman said £3 and 4 shillings, and she saw the arithmetic clearly enough. She would be short by 16 shillings and 1 month's candles, and most of what she had planned to send to her dressmaker. She gave the footman what she had and told him to note the remainder as a personal loan against the estate, and that if her mother wished to dispute it, she would dispute it with Lady Morland herself. The footman looked uncertain. She looked at the footman in a way that resolved his uncertainty. He took the money and left. The girl stopped, crying. Cecily turned to begin walking again, and found that the Earl had come off his horse without her noticing, and was standing in the lane 3 feet from her. His horse stood to his right, and his gloved hand rested on the saddle pommel in the attitude of a man who has stopped moving abruptly and has not yet decided what to do next. His hand was close enough to her shoulder that she was conscious of it, as though her coat were thin. He did not close the distance. He said, "That was your own money." "Yes," Cecily said. "You did not consider asking me." She looked at him. "It did not occur to me that it was your responsibility," she said. "The child is on moorland land. The debt is a moorland matter." He was looking at her with an expression she could not name. She had catalogued by that point a considerable range of his expressions, most of which were variations on controlled, and this one was not controlled. It was something else, something she did not have a word for, and did not think she was entitled to name. "Walk back," he said. "You will be cold." It was an order. She walked. The warmth along her left side, where he fell into step beside her, stayed with her all the way to the door. If you have found yourself in the pages of a story you were certain was not yours, leave a word in the comments. Cecily had not found herself in any story at all. She had found herself in a morning in the lane, and she did not know yet what it meant. 3 days after that morning, the Earl of Wyndham requested a private quarter of an hour with Cecily in the Moreland drawing-room. Lady Moreland was not present. His aunt was not present. The fire was low, and the room smelled of beeswax and the cut flowers that someone kept replacing in the Chinese vases. He stood at the window when she entered, his back to her, and he said, without turning, "My wife died 2 years past." Cecily did not say that she knew this. She did not say anything. He turned from the window, and his face was the face of someone who has been carrying something for so long that the weight of it has become indistinguishable from the weight of him. "She was afraid of me," he said. Not in the way that people mean when they say a woman was afraid of her husband. I do not mean harm. I mean that my manner frightened her. My rank frightened her. The way I spoke frightened her. And I knew it. And I believed that with time she would cease to be frightened, and she did not have time. She died before I could tell her that her fear was not something she had earned. He looked at the fire, which was burning low and needed tending. I had been given to understand, he said, that a woman of gentle disposition was what I required. I believed that a woman who did not challenge me was a woman who was at peace with me. I understand now that I was wrong about this, but I arrived at this understanding too late to matter for Helen. Cecily said, "You are telling me this because you are afraid you will repeat the pattern with my sister." He looked at her then, and what was in his face was not the careful, controlled watchfulness she had catalogued across 3 weeks of breakfasts. It was something closer to recognition. The recognition of a man who has said a true thing to someone who has received it truly without flinching, without performing comfort, without manufacturing sympathy to smooth over the discomfort of an honest moment. "I am telling you this," he said, "because you are the only person in this house who has looked at me without either fear or calculation." Cecily was aware of the fire, low and insufficient, and the cold creeping in at the window frames, and the specific quality of her own heartbeat, which had decided, without consulting her, to become audible somewhere in her throat. She was aware of him across the width of the turkey carpet, and the 12 feet of winter air between them, and the precise weight of what he had just said, and what she understood him to mean, and had no right to pursue. "That is not the same thing," she said carefully, "as what you have come to Moreland Hall to find." He held her gaze. "No," he said, "it is not." Neither of them said anything after that. Cecily excused herself. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and pressed both hands flat against her sternum, as though she could slow by force a thing that had decided to move. She did not see him alone again. There were 3 days remaining in the betrothal visit, and then 2, and then 1. And on the last evening there was a dinner, at which his aunt referred to Cecily, in a remark aimed at a neighboring lady, as the younger sister, the spare, not the intended. And it was delivered with enough warmth in its register to pass as explanation rather than dismissal. And Cecily watched the Earl's hand go still on the stem of his wineglass, and watched him not look at her, which told her a great deal that she did not want to know. She went to bed that night with the specific composure of a woman who has decided what she is allowed to feel and is adhering to the decision with both hands. He left the following morning. She was not present when his carriage departed. And then it was the morning of the wedding. Lady Moreland came to the bridal chamber at 8:30, and she came not to find Dorothea, who was already 20 miles from Moreland Hall by then, but to find Cecily, which she did, standing in the window in the wedding gown that had been altered overnight to fit her different frame. The Honiton veil. Not yet on her head, but laid across the dressing table like a second thought. Her mother looked at her for a long, silent moment. Then she said, in the voice she used for things that were being clarified rather than discussed, "You are the spare. You have always been the spare. What is happening today is the result of Dorothea's cowardice, and you will stand where she should have stood, and you will not make a scene. I intend to explain at the altar," Cecily said. "I will not speak vows as though I were someone I am not. You will do what the family requires," her mother said. Cecily looked at her mother's face and saw there everything she had always seen there. The calculation, the machinery of a woman who had organized her children into instruments and could not imagine them as anything else. She thought of Dorothea in the carriage with Thomas Crane. She thought of the girl in the lane, the wheelbarrow, the bundled household goods. She thought of a man standing at a window, telling her the truth about his grief. "I will stand at the altar," Cecily said. "I will not speak his name in the vows." Lady Morland made a sound that was not quite a response, and left the room. Cecily lifted the veil from the dressing table and looked at the pale gold flowers along its edge for a moment. She thought of her grandmother, whose name she knew, but whose face she could not recall. She put the veil on. Mrs. Fellows was waiting in the corridor. She was 61 years old and had run the Morland household for 30 of them, and had never, to Cecily's knowledge, contradicted Lady Morland outright. She looked at Cecily now with an expression that was not pity, and was not approval, but was something closer to witness, the expression of someone who has seen enough of the world to understand what is happening without needing to judge it. "You are a good girl," Mrs. Fellows said. "Whatever occurs." "Thank you," Cecily said, and then, because there was nothing left to do and the carriage was waiting, she went downstairs. The church was Andrews at Heverton, the village church where the Morland family had married for 4 generations. It was small and cold and filled on that gray November morning with everyone in the county who had managed to secure an invitation or a pretense of one. The flowers had been arranged by someone with a generous hand and an abundance of white chrysanthemums, which filled the stone building with a sweetness that was almost too much for the cold air to sustain. Candles burned in the sconces. The pews were full. Cecily entered on her elder cousin's arm, because her father had been dead for 6 years and Lady Morland had selected the cousin for his height and his willingness to follow direction. The veil was down over her face, which was, she understood, the point. She looked at the stone floor in front of her feet, the gray flagstones, the worn edges where generations of Morland brides had walked. She walked the same path. The Earl of Wyndham was standing at the altar rail. She knew his stillness by now. She had catalogued it, memorized it, returned to it in the sleepless hour before dawn, more times than she was willing to account for. His back was to her as she walked. He was in dark blue, the coat perfectly fitted, his bearing the precise and deliberate composure of a man holding himself very still. Beside him stood a solicitor she did not recognize, who held a document she understood to be the formal marriage certificate. The vicar began the service. Cecily stood where Dorothea should have stood, and heard the words falling around her like snow, beautiful and cold and requiring nothing from her yet. She looked at the candles on the altar, their flames steady in the enclosed air. She thought that this would be the moment she would remember for the rest of her life, standing in borrowed clothes in her grandmother's veil, in a church full of witnesses who believed she was her sister, while the man beside her did not yet know that everything Lady Morland had arranged was already dissolved. The vicar reached the passage that required the veil to be raised. Cecily raised it herself, before anyone could reach for it, because she was not willing to be unveiled by someone else. She raised it and looked at the Earl of Wyndham. He was already looking at her, not with surprise, not with the confusion of a man confronting an unexpected face. He was looking at her with the expression she had not been able to name in the lane. The expression that had nothing controlled in it, that was not the careful watchfulness of 3 weeks of breakfast, but something older than that, something prior to all his management and restraint. The church went very quiet. The sound of the quiet was like a physical thing, like the moment after a bell is struck when the note is still in the air. Behind them, a voice said, in the clipped low register of a woman who is very seldom surprised, "This is not Miss Dorothea." The crowd shifted. Cecily heard her mother make a sound. She kept her eyes on his face. The vicar looked between them with the expression of a man who has officiated a great many events and has never had reason to prepare for this particular circumstance. Cecily said steadily, "My sister has chosen another path. I am here to explain that to you and to the assembled guests. I am Cecily Morland. I am not the bride who was intended." The veil was in her hands. She held it and looked at him. He said nothing for a moment. The moment was long. The crowd's collective breath was a presence in the cold air. His aunt said something Cecily could not hear to the woman beside her. Lady Morland said in a carrying whisper, "This is the spare. She has no standing to be here." And the words landed in the silence like stones in still water. He looked at Cecily for a count of 3 heartbeats that she felt entirely. Then he said, in a voice that was quiet and level and not intended for the crowd, but that the crowd heard nonetheless because the silence was complete, "Miss Cecily Morland, will you consent to be my wife?" 12 words. She looked at him. She had made, in the night, a kind of peace with her invisibility. She had organized herself in the gray hours before morning around the assumption that she would always be the version of herself that was not the prize, not the investment, not the daughter the ledger named. She had made a home of that. It had been a small home, and it had been cold, and she had not known until this moment that she had been waiting for someone to open the door and look in and see not the absence of Dorothea but the presence of Cecily. The church waited. She understood that answering would unmake her life, as she had known it. She understood that answering yes to a question no one had thought to ask her would require her to become a different kind of person than the one who had spent 23 years being useful in the spaces no one occupied. She looked at his face, the jaw set with the effort of a man holding very still, the pale gray eyes that she knew by now were not cold but watchful, that had been watching her across 3 weeks of breakfasts and cold gardens and an afternoon in a lane, and that were watching her now with an attention so complete and so specific that it reorganized. Without violence, everything she had previously understood about what it meant to be seen. "Yes," she said, "I consent." The sound that moved through the church was not quite a gasp. It was more like the sound of a collective breath being released, the sound of a room that had been holding itself in anticipation, discovering it was allowed to exhale. He turned to the vicar and said, "You will proceed with the ceremony." The vicar, who was a practical man of God and had by this point an instinct for when something larger than ordinary propriety was at work, proceeded with the ceremony. The crowd did not proceed quietly. Among the witnesses, Mrs. Hazen, Fletcher from the neighboring estate touched her daughter's arm and said in a carrying undertone, "Well, he knows his own mind. Well, he knows his own mind." Lord Bexley, who had come expecting entertainment of a lesser kind, found himself unexpectedly moved and was not certain he wished to examine why. In the front row, Lady Morland had gone the color of old wax and had not moved since the declaration landed. Beside her, his aunt sat with her fan closed in her lap and her face working through several successive expressions before settling into something that was, if not precisely approval, at least a recognition of defeat. The vows were spoken. They were spoken by the new Countess of Wyndham and her husband, and they were spoken correctly, without substitution. The solicitor stepped forward at the appropriate moment and confirmed the formalities of the certificate, which required amendment to reflect the correct name. He made the amendment without visible distress, which suggested to Cecily that he was very good at his work, or very well compensated for it, and probably both. When the vicar pronounced them married, the Earl offered his arm and Cecily took it, and she felt through the sleeve of the coat and the fabric of her borrowed glove the warmth of him and the steadiness and the slight tension in the forearm of a man who has maintained composure under severe pressure and is only now beginning to release it. They walked out of the church into the November air, and the doors closed behind them, and the crowd's voices rose behind the closed doors in the specific register of people who have witnessed something that will be talked about for the rest of the season, and possibly longer. In the lane outside the church, in the private moment before the carriages came, he stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The air was cold and very still. The elms along the churchyard wall were stripped bare, and the gray sky above them was the color of old pewter, and the quiet, after the church's noise, was the quiet of the whole country, resting. He said, without looking at her, "I did not know I was choosing until I was. It was not the calibrated public line. It was the other thing, the thing beneath the other thing. The sentence, a man says, when the witnesses are gone and the ceremony is complete, and there is only the cold air and the person standing next to him and the fact of what has just occurred." Cecily said, "I know." He looked at her then. She looked at him. The veil was still in her hand, folded carefully into a small square of pale gold lace. She thought of Mrs. Fellows in the corridor saying, "You are a good girl." She thought of Dorothea on the post road with Thomas Crane, and hoped, with the whole of whatever remained of her composure, that they were warm. She thought of Helen, who had been afraid of him and had not had time to cease being afraid, and she understood with a precision that surprised her that this man beside her was asking, in the only way he knew how to ask, whether she would be willing to give him the chance to be different than he had been. She had paid £3 and 4 shillings for a farmer's daughter and said nothing about it. She had answered his questions directly when he asked them. She had looked at him without either fear or calculation, which was not a virtue, but simply her nature, and she saw that he had counted it as one, and she was willing, for the moment, to let him. The carriage arrived. They rode to Wyndham Park in a quiet that was not uncomfortable, which was, she would later understand, its own kind of declaration. He told her that the housekeeper at Wyndham Park was called Mrs. Beats, Gray, and had been with the family for 12 years, and would be at the door. He told her the park had a library of 400 volumes, most of which were worth reading. He told her that the south prospect from the morning room was better than the north, and that the kitchen garden was somewhat neglected, as no one had attended it properly since the previous autumn. He told her that there was a stone bench at the edge of the east garden that caught the afternoon sun even in November, if the clouds cooperated, and that it had been his wife's favorite place, and that he had not sat there since her death, but that he thought perhaps he might sit there again. He told her these things as though they were ordinary facts, and not the small, intimate architecture of a life being offered, room by room, to someone who was being invited in. She looked out the carriage window at the country passing, the bare trees, and the gray fields and the low winter sky, and she thought that she had lived for 23 years in the space between rooms, in the corridor where no one went, and that she was not certain yet what it would be like to stand inside one. She thought she might find out. On the evening of the day that would later be described in a dozen drawing rooms across the county as the Moreland wedding, a small fire was lit in the long gallery at Wyndham Park, and Mrs. Gray had put out tea on the low table, and the light came through the long windows in the particular quality of November dusk, that is, the color of pewter going warm. She was now the Countess of Wyndham, and she set the Oniton veil on the table and looked at the pale gold flowers for a long moment. She would, in the morning, send it to Mrs. Fellows with a note. Press this carefully. It belongs to Dorothea when she has occasion for it. She had no way of knowing whether Dorothea had arrived safely at her curate's side, whether Lady Moreland had recovered her composure, whether his aunt had found cause to revise her opinion of the spare. She would find out in time. Everything would find its shape in time. Julian was at the far end of the gallery, standing as he so often stood, turned slightly toward a window, his profile against the dying light. She had last seen that profile in the cold of a November morning, and now here it was again, in the warm dusk of an evening that belonged to both of them, and she found that she was still learning to look at it without cataloguing it, without filing it away in the space behind her chest where she kept the things she was not allowed to want. She went and stood beside him. He did not turn. But he was aware of her, she knew, because the stillness in him altered very slightly, became the different stillness of a person who is aware of warmth nearby. "There is a portrait of Helen," he said, "in the east corridor. I have not moved it." "No," Cecily said. "I will not pretend she did not exist. I would not ask you to." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the park was going dark, the elms bare and beautiful against the winter sky. A fire crackled in the grate behind them, and the tea Mrs. Gray had brought was still warm, and the veil lay on the table in the firelight, its pale gold flowers catching the light and giving it back. He said, "She was afraid of me because she did not know me. I intend to make certain you know me." Cecily considered this. "I already know you somewhat," she said. "Yes," he said, "you do." He turned from the window, and she was close. Closer than she had allowed herself to be in 3 weeks of breakfasts in cold gardens and one afternoon in a lane, and the light in the gallery was warm and insufficient and very kind. He raised one hand and touched with the backs of his fingers. The line of her jaw, the way one touches something one has been trying not to touch for a long time. She did not step back. She was not afraid of him. She had not been afraid of him in a cold corridor at 7 in the morning, and she was not afraid of him now. In the firelight, with his hand at her jaw and the whole of a life in this house still ahead of them, unwritten, belonging to no one yet. She put her hand over his. She felt against her palm the particular warmth of a man who has held himself very still for a very long time, beginning at last to let go the fire, spoke once, settling. Outside the park was dark, and the November air was cold, and the elms were bare, and the sky was the kind of clear that comes after a day of clouds, the kind that promises frost by morning, and is for the moment simply beautiful. Cicely had gone to a church that morning as the spare, the one from whom things could be taken without consequence. She had walked out of it as someone whose name had been spoken, in public, by a man who did not frighten her, and whom she was beginning to understand she did not frighten, but clarified, which was perhaps the rarer and more valuable thing. The veil lay on the table. The fire burned. She was home. If Cecily's morning has stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. Thank you for remaining until the end.